Dear friends, dear colleagues, thank you very much that, dear Professor Hanush, that it was possible for me to address you today. It's a great honor for me to speak on Masaryk Day, since your first president, Tomáše Garrigua Masaryka, is one of the figures in the history of the 20th century, which may be supposed among most positive and among people who built the democracy in not only in Czechoslovakia at that time, but almost in Europe, because Europe was not democratic continent in the time of Tomáš Masaryk. And if we start to speak about democracy in Russia, it's necessary to say that now the main problem is not how to win the war by Ukrainians, by Ukraine. I think that it's rather clear that the victory will be with Ukraine, I hope in the nearest future, in some months, a military victory. But the main problem, and there is no problem what to do with Ukraine after this, because everybody in Europe, in NATO, among Rammstein coalition, they understand well that Ukraine ought to be a part of Europe, a part of NATO, and it's necessary to help Ukraine to re-emerge after this terrible devastation which took place because of a Russian assault. So it's clear. It's clear, though it's difficult. Of course, it's a very problematic thing in materials, in money, but it's clear in general. The problem which is not so clear is the problem of Russia. What to do with Russia after it lost this war? What to do with it? From time to time, I hear the words of politicians, well-known politicians, that since Russia will never, or maybe will never in the future be a democratic country with real human rights. So it's better to build some new iron curtain and to divide Europe between democratic Europe, including Ukraine, and Russia. There are even speakers who suppose it's better to divide Russia to some states and also to use this curtain, some non-democratic states in the eastern part of Europe and in Siberia. Because Russia, by its mentality, can't be democracy. I think that these statements are erroneous and groundless. It's necessary to understand that democracy, which is of course one of the main achievements of mankind, is a last gift of humanity. I don't speak about antique democracy. It's another lecture, it's another theme, and it's of course interesting to speak about democracy in ancient Greece and ancient India, and there was democratic elements in both these regions. But if we speak about new time Europe, we ought to understand, dear colleagues, that 2.5 centuries ago, there were no one democratic country in European continent, only England. But even England was not a democratic country before glorious revolution, before the end of 17th century, before the Bill of Rights of 1689. Not the Magna Charta, but Bill of Rights of William III in 1689. And between this Bill of Rights, British Bill of Rights, and French Revolution is 1 century. And only after the French Revolution we may say about democracy in the continent. And only in the beginning of the 19th century, these democratic trends, in some way following Napoleonic tradition, in some way in Germany, for example, resisting it, occurred in other parts of Europe, in Spain, with much difficulties, in Germany, not in Austria at that time, later in Austria. So only 19th century may be named the century of democracy in Europe, and of course the 20th. And you will speak about the reasons why in 18th, 19th century Europe turned to be a democratic region. We ought to search some objective reasons, because of course there were subjective reasons. Subject reason is nostalgia on antique world, the nostalgia on the classic tradition, in some way Renaissance in politics, and everybody after the French Revolution want to be citizens, citoyens, and democrats. But even at that time, human rights and democracy supposed to be different things. And step by step, only in the 19th century, democracy turned to be a natural form of state organization in Europe. If we speak about objective reasons, I think it's my idea. I think that, but not of course only mine, that the level of literacy is the main reason for democracy. Democracy may be in the country where people can understand political reality. And in 18th and 19th centuries, there were not, of course, TV, no movie, no internet, and the only way to understand reality, political reality, before literacy occurred in Europe was church and priest who explained his parishes the political situation from time to time. But when newspapers start to be published and turn to be the part of common interest, and it is the 18th century in Europe, it depends on literacy. And when simple people start to read newspapers, they made the first step toward democracy. Not immediately, not even in one generation, in some generations. After literacy spread, democracy came. It's another lecture why literacy started to spread only in 18th century in Europe, but I want to mention some figures. In France, in the beginning of 18th century, in 1720, 1724, only 34% of population were literate. In 1875, 93% of population were literate. If we compare the figures among new recruits to army in different European countries, among them, in 1875, for example, in Italy, 52% were illiterate, and in 1911, 30%. So you see these dynamics from illiteracy to literacy. Other reason, also maybe not formal but cultural, is national romanticism. In national romanticism, ideas which came to Europe after Enlightenment, just in the end of 18th century, after Great French Revolution, in these ideas of national romanticism, nation supposed to be some entity, some real entity with its interests, with its values, with its deeds and misdeeds. And if it is nation, not persons, so nation ought to understand itself, according to Hegelian philosophy. Nation ought to understand itself. And if it's necessary for nation to understand itself, it's necessary for nation to be literate. That's why the laws of obligatory education occurred first in Prussia in 1763, then in Austria 1774, then Denmark 1814, United States 1852, Japan 1872, Italy 1877, and Russia 1911. So this idea that it's necessary to have educated population. It is not from nothing idea, it's from cultural development of countries. And the result of this was democracy. Democracy with increasing electorate. Because in 19th century, everywhere electorate was shortened by rather rich people, by men, not women, by literate people, etc. In the 20th century, electorate increased to all citizens. You remember that in Great Britain, women received the possibility to vote in elections only after the First World War, in 1919. So Russia was in this trend in some way. Of course, it was a little bit late, but in 1905 it occurred first Russian Revolution, and on the 17th of October 1905, the manifest which allowed parliamentary elections, constitution, and all other democratic things occurred in Russia, and from 1905 up till the Bolsheviks' coup d'etat, Russia was approximately democratic country, just as many continental countries. For example, it was close in the level of democracy to German Empire and to Austrian Empire. But in the 20th century, dear friends, we see very dangerous thing. We see a returning autocracy in rather developed countries of Europe. In Italy, from 1927, fascist autocracy occurred. In Germany, after 1933, Nazi, terrible totalitarian regime occurred. In Spain, first communist, then Franquist authoritarian regimes were established after 1936 up till 1975. In Greece, we see in this homeland of democracy. We see new autocracy. After democratic system during almost all 19th century, we see autocratic regime from 1967 till 1974. Just as in Portuguese, where autocracy occurred in the end of 30s and also after up till the 1974. Why authoritarian regimes returned to countries with educated population, as Italy or Germany? What's the reason? I think that the reason is, of course, there are a lot of historical reasons, some lost wars, etc. But there is also objective reason. It is not literacy, it's propaganda. Propaganda changed changed its face, changed its methods in the 20th century. In 19th century, a newspaper was the only form of contact between government, between state and people. And to take information from the newspaper, it is not so easy thing as you suppose. It's necessary to read, to think, to make some solutions after reading and understanding the text. For simple people, it was not easy, so people made an effort to make this intellectual step. But in the 20th century, new forms of information occurred. It is radio, of course, and movie. It's necessary to remember that Vladimir Lenin, one of the first totalitarian dictator of Russia, just in the beginning of 20th, wrote that among all arts, most necessary for us is cinema. At that time, movie was not so great, there was no Hollywood, etc. But he understood very well that cinema is a direct penetration of information into the brain of man. And all authoritarian regimes, from Mussolini up till Putin now, they understand very well that the first and absolutely necessary step for their rule is the control of information. Who control information, control politics. Who control politics, control the state. That's why the returning authoritarianism had its reason, these new forms of propaganda. But we may speak about, and it's necessary to say that only after 1975, so it is the year of Helsinki Declaration, only in the year 1975, we may say about democratic Western Europe. In this year or year before, Greece, Portuguese, Spain turned to be democracies. Only at that time. So democratic Europe is not some situation from ancient ages. It's a rather modern gift for our civilization. And as we speak about post-communist Europe, of course, it's 1990. So only 32 years ago, not so long distance. And in this shift to democracy, after the war, maybe after the defeat in the war, as in Germany and Italy, the very great part in this return to democracy play intellectuals. Since propaganda is the main source of dictatorship, and propaganda is very strong because these new methods of propaganda, which penetrate into brains and accepted by the people, not intellectually, but emotionally, as cinema or radio and then TV. The counter-propaganda is the mission of intellectuals. It's not simple counter-propaganda that some intellectual will speak on TV if it turned to be possible. No. It is the sum of ideas which intellectuals may give against propaganda. Since, for example, in Germany, Nazi propaganda was finished in 1945, in May 1945. But people continue to be under the pressure of this propaganda. And even in 1947, in Hamburg, majority of people, it's a British zone of occupation, majority of people named Adolf Hitler the greatest figure in German history. And I ought you to say that, for example, in Portugal, today, the majority of people suppose Salazar the greatest figure of Portuguese past. Just now, just in democratic Portugal, a part of NATO and European Union. So these trends of authoritarian system continue to be strong, and only intellectuals can overcome it. And we know very well who was the person who did so, or maybe who did the first step in Nazi Germany. It was Karl Jaspers, of course. Karl Jaspers and his lectures in Heidelberg University. In 1945, he started this explanation about the guilt of German nation, not immediately, but in 3 decades, the deeds of Karl Jaspers and many other Christian philosophers, Catholic and Lutheran philosophers of Germany, and among them, of course, such politicians as Konrad Adenauer, situation changed. And now, I think, only a very small percent of German people suppose Nazi regime and Adolf Hitler personally something great in German history. Without this intellectual trend, it was impossible. In Italy, it was Alcido de Gasperi, the great man, the leader of Christian Democratic Party, person who was in prison during the Mussolini regime and then worked as a simple librarian in Vatican. He turned to be the Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and one of the organizers of the first European Union in the beginning of 50s. He was a person and his colleagues who explained people who help people to escape from this totalitarian propaganda. And it's possible to name another people in other countries. In your country, in Czech Republic, of course, it's Václav Havel. It's true. In Italy, in Poland, it's Tadeusz Mazowiecki. It's only one. I name one. Of course, there are a lot of people around. In Russia, it's Andrei Sakharov. So intellectual donation to this liberation after totalitarian regime, after this returning autocracy of the 20th century, not only great, it is absolutely important. Without it, no liberation would occur. I suppose that in Portuguese, there were not a person, one person, maybe a group of persons, who successfully reached the hearts of the people of this small European country. And that's why Salazar continued to be the greatest person in Portuguese. But in Russian, now, to say frankly, you will ask, yes, thank you, who is the greatest person? The majority of people answer, I'm sorry, it's Stalin. It's Stalin. So, we ought to continue. We ought to continue our attempts to liberate Russian people. We understand very well that democracy is as close to Russia as to Portugal, as to Czechia, as to Germany or Italy. Russia is not a country which cannot produce democracy in itself. Why? It's another interesting question, and I try to explain it in some minutes. What is the main principle of democracy? The main principle of democracy, not elections. The main principle of democracy is the destiny of person, of man and woman. Destiny of a person. Person is has absolute destiny. It is higher than any price. And what is the reason for this attitude to person? Person is not an element of people. Person is more than people. Each person is more than people. And what is the reason for this suggestion? I am sure that the reason for this suggestion is Christian attitude to personality. Christian attitude to personality. Because in each person, Christian faith, gospel word, see Christ. Everybody is Christ, just Christ. So this person is out of price and ought to have all possibilities to organize his life, and both personal life and political life. And all these people, almost all these people which I named, not, for example, Andrei Sakharov, who was unbeliever, but the majority of these people, De Gasperi, Konrad Adenauer, Karl Jaspers, Alcido de Gasperi in Italy, Tadeusz Mazowiecki in Poland, all of them were not only religious persons, but they follow the principle of Christian personalism. These wonderful philosophical ideas which occurred, which emerged in France between the wars and after the Second World War, start to be the main idea of Europe. Europe turned from nationalism, which turned to be bankrupt in the time of the Second World War, to Christian personalism. Not nation, not social class, and not race, but person is the main thing in the world. And this idea, this philosophical attitude connected very strongly absolutely maybe, with the principles of democracy. Now in Russia, we see the total primitivization of society. Total primitivization of society. Mr. Putin and his collaborators wanted to degrade the intellectual potential of Russian people. They want to return Russia to 19th century, maybe to 18th century, to epoch of nationalism, epoch of collective and ethnical identity, etc. And this is the main principle. In one day, Mr. Putin disappeared. I hope this day will come, not in a very large distance for us. And what we ought to do after this? The main attitude is we ought to do two things. One, practical, organization of a system of democracy, of federation, of ethnical equality of all ethnicities. But it's political engineering, it's necessary, and it's not so difficult. It's easy. Much more difficult is to re-emerge human soul from all these tenets in which totalitarian, communist, and authoritarian Putin's regime organized around it. So liberation of the soul, liberation of brains, liberation of intellect of nation is the greatest our goal. And of course, without intellectuals, it's impossible to do so. We ought to give some first step in teaching and in our personal behavior also. Politics and education. Two main things which is necessary to do in Russia. And I am sure that if we do it successfully, in the nearest future, Russia turned to be and will be able to be a democratic country, just as Italy turned to be a democratic country after Mussolini, Germany after Hitler, Czech Republic, Poland, and other states of Central Europe after communist rule. And Russia is not a different thing. Russia also a Christian country with this inner idea of personal value of each human soul. And for me, it's absolutely clear that counter-propaganda will be fruitful in Russia if we started, even not now, but yesterday. We had to start it yesterday, and we started it. And we continue it today, and we'll do it tomorrow, and we'll see a new Russian nation in the nearest future, a part of democratic Europe, and maybe even a stronghold of democratic Europe. Just as now, Germany is a stronghold of democracy, economic stability, and human rights in European continent. Germany, who was not democracy 2 centuries ago. But things was changed and continue to change, and I hope for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zubov, for your lecture, and it is my great honor now for me to welcome Mr. Jaroslav Kurfürst. here at Masaryk University, here at Faculty of Social Studies. Mr. Kurfürst was an ambassador to Belgium and diplomat, and currently serves as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. He is also active in academia, focusing on geopolitics and Russian geopolitical thought. Mr. Kurfürst, the floor. Yes.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Lady Scruton, Vice Rectors, distinguished Professor Zubov, professors, dear colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen. Let me thank Masaryk University for inviting me to share a couple of remarks as a reaction to Professor Zubov's lecture. Let me thank also Professor Zubov for giving us a hope for more democratic Russia in the near future. And also let me thank him for his personal courage as the intellectual carrying the mission of the intellectuals for democracy and for the humanistic values. I cannot start by the war. Already for 372 days, we do follow the tragedy of millions of Ukrainians whose lives were devastated by Russian aggression. We see crippled soldiers, dead bodies. We hear about kidnapped children, broken cities, broken Ukrainian economy, destroyed Mariupol, never-ending list of the war crimes like Bucha, Irpin, Borodyanka, like Kramatorsk, Dnipro. We see cities which were almost erased from the surface of the earth, turned into the battlefield like Severodonetsk or now Bakhmut. Russians planned the war as several days special operation with a quick victory. They miscalculated. We see the improvisation of Russian military, which is lasting for all year, more than a year. Some 200,000 Russian soldiers were killed or wounded. All this human suffering has already become a significant historical event, irreversibly marking the 21st century with a bloody trace. The result will transform Europe, will transform the world, and I hope it will one day transform Russia in a good way. It contributes to a dangerous atmosphere globally, and it makes us think and fear about the spillover, about the escalation, and yet we do not see the end. But let me ask, where was the beginning? Was it the discovery of young, hard-working KGB officer by Valentin Yumashev or by Igor Chubais? Was it the nostalgia of Russian nation after the community of common destiny called USSR? Was it the tradition of autocracy or imperial nationalism promoted by tsars and secretary generals alike? Is there something irreversibly special in Russian psyche that is perpetuating illiberal destiny? What is it that Russian traumatic search for identity is always turning and fighting the picture, the ideal imagination of the homogenized Europe and the West? I do not want to analyze the roots of the war, but as Professor Zubov did, I want to discuss prospects of Russian democracy. I have to admit I'm far more skeptical than Professor Zubov on that subject. The biggest obstacle I see to democracy in Russia is a majority consensus about imperial idea in that country. This imperial idea needs the strong hand to keep all the diverse Russian nations and communities calm, under control. It is this imperial idea which is militarizing the society, infecting it constantly with the virus of hypertrophic patriotism and pushing the Russian world beyond the state borders under the pretext of security concern of the sacralized homeland. I'm skeptical because the imperial idea is not conducive with democracy. But before I develop my argument, I need to make an important disclaimer. I agree with Professor Zubov that we cannot look at any nation through the glasses and lenses of some historical determinism or geographical determinism. No community is condemned to some pre-written destiny, one pattern of fatal development or genetically encoded curse. And it is not true that Russia does not have democrats. I know them. Brave but rare. They are individuals to whom I want to pay a tribute, loudly and very sincerely. It is a small crowd facing a giant oppressive state. I want to pay tribute to Professor Zubov personally, as he is one of them. Yes, evolution of Russia towards the democratic future is possible, but only in a large historical context and in a longer time frame. However, I'm skeptical about the appearance of meaningful democratic power in Russia in the foreseeable future, as there are no grounds for it, no tradition. Every nation builds on its traditions, and one generation gives its heritage in the evolutionary way to another in the unbreakable chain of collective memory. Every moral devastation has thus transgenerational character. In the history of Russia, I see individual democrats, but I do not see meaningful democratic tradition free of imperial idea. Russian and Soviet empires were different in their form, but in essence, both were based on this imperial idea. There will be no quick change, I'm afraid. The idea that the curtain will go up and out of the sudden we will have Russian democrats in Russia, it's not realistic. Let's be clear. Liberal democracy and democrats are the targets of this war. Russia is targeting democracies, and the first target is democratic Ukraine. But the big target is liberal democracy as such. One of the lessons after the collapse of the Soviet Union was the realization that the Soviet Union as a state, as a geopolitical entity collapsed after its ideological superstructure collapsed, after the ideological glue collapsed, after the communist ideology was done, was eroded, was not credible. The Russian Siloviki have therefore come to the conclusions that the way forward to defeat the West towards the destruction of the European Union and NATO leads through the destruction of its ideological basis, through the destruction of liberal democracy and democratic values. They created very effective tools of propaganda and information warfare to attack them. They used all the technologies Professor Zubov was discussing. They did not understand that the ideology constructed by the state or one political party is something completely different from the values experienced and rooted through the history. The break in relations with the West has never been more radical. Russia has attacked the humanistic core of the West and its values. This is the difference from Spanish or Austrian historical autocracies. And also the role of the church is different. The church, in the long run, in Russia is accomplice of or ally of the regime. There was no division between church and state. The militant patriotism has enormous potential to generate hatred, which is now directed towards the West and Ukraine. But with more failures on the battlefield and in the global arena, this hatred has the potential to turn inward on Russian society. The search for an internal enemy already started again, and the remaining Russian Democrats and liberals are in danger. History might overcome this, but it will take time. The Russians who 10 years ago still wanted the modernization partnership with Europe are now separated from Europe by this aggressive war. The new alternative partnership with Chinese communism is an alliance aimed at destroying democracy and its humanistic roots. The prospects of democracy today in Russia are slim. Putin's regime and its aggressive imperialism will be judged by history in a negative way, but it is more likely that it will be continued by another autocrat who might condemn the war, who might destroy the Putin's legacy, but continue the authoritarian and imperial tradition. After all, Stalin was succeeded by Khrushchev, and then Brezhnev followed. Even if Russia loses the war, we have to admit that it will result mainly in a return of the stolen territory to Ukraine. This is why I'm skeptical about the shift of political culture. Germany transformed completely its political culture in a short period of time. But what preceded this change? Not only the devastating defeat, broken German cities, the Soviet flag flying over the Reichstag, but also the division of the country into the occupation zones and Nuremberg process bringing about the accountability. This was the starting point of denazification of Germany, and it will not happen in Russia, because no one wants to defeat Russia as such, only its colonial campaign in Ukraine. Russia may be defeated in Ukraine, but Putin regime might continue for a while. Of course, one day, Democrats will have to build on an existing tradition, that future Russian democracy. Now the history. Yes, Peter the Great opened the window to Europe, which Putin now closed. But we all know that Peter's admiration for the West had nothing to do with the admiration of democratic tradition or the governing method democracy. But even the rulers who came with the liberal agendas switched. Now on the Tsarist side, the visions of Catherine the Great, which were just incorporated in Bolshoi Nakaz, were derailed when she dismissed Alexander Radishev and Nikolai Novikov and introduced censorship. Alexander I ceased to listen to Mikhail Speransky and founded Holy Alliance. Alexander II also abandoned gradually the liberal vision. The other Tsars did not even want to try. The Bolsheviks and Soviets, of course, cannot be suspected by any democratic aspirations. There was no strong tradition among intelligentsia either. Admiration of French rationalism in Russia peaked with Decembrists, but the basis of the diverse concept of Decembrists circulating in their circles, they were variations of on the Russian imperial policy. Liberal and conservative agendas in 19th century were quite different from our current understanding of the notion. And the international law did not exist at that time. But virtually all 19th century westernizers accepted the imperial idea quite automatically. Yes, there were very few honorable exceptions like Pyotr Chadaev or like Vladimir Solovyov. After the Bolshevik coup d'etat, white exile was imperial by definition. And Soviets really did not produce any democratic ground. So the 90s with Gorbachev and Yeltsin were the most interesting periods, but way too short. Today, facing this giant imperial state, only a small part of intellectuals pursue the brave path of searching the way to democracy, engaging with the free media and foreign agent-labeled organization, countering the propaganda, or teaching new generation in real history. Many of them left Russia others face persecution. The majority of Russian society adopted the position of collective cynicism, valuelessness, and apathy. When Vasily Rozanov, end of the 19th century, once discussed the Russian destiny, he wrote the article called Praying Russia. And he wrote, in a verse, I quote, "The darker is the night, the brighter are the stars. The deeper is the suffering, the closer is the God." End of quote. I find here the basics of nihilistic doctrine appearing in Russian history repeatedly, and I do spot this idea fitting to the current Russian society. We have to be ready for a longer period of hostile neighborhood in the East, but it will, of course, not last forever. We saw the Iron Curtain times and successful expansion of the USSR. Back then, Soviets were offering the world three big trumps. First, charisma of the victor in the Second World War. Second, socially attractive universalistic ideology. And third, the decolonization narrative. Putin's Russia does not have any universalistic idea and needs the colonial war in Ukraine. Still, it can corrupt, spread lies, propaganda, and disinformation, and cannot be underestimated. We are still in the phase of dismantling our ties between Russia and Europe and the West. During the Czech presidency in the EU Council, we pushed for strategic discussion about the key principles of the EU policy towards Russia. The EU debate concluded in the agreement on the following principles. First, to isolate Russia internationally, so we are imposing the sanction and restrictive measures. Second, to ensure accountability by holding Russia perpetrators responsible for violation of international law and war crimes, and we are looking also for the punishment of the crime of aggression. The third, to support European Union's neighbors, and of course that's the enlargement, and that's Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia especially. Fourth, to adopt EU security and defense. And finally, our today's topic, fifth, to support Russian civil society, democrats, human rights defenders, and independent media inside and outside Russia. This last element is our moral obligation. Free democratic voices in today's Russia are under heavy pressure, and we need to give them the hand. In Czechia, we do have the special program for them, the program for civil society. And I'm very proud that also the Czech universities responded always quickly to the needs of democrats in Eastern Europe. Belarusians who were subject of repressions by the regime in 2020, Ukrainians fleeing the war, and Russian Democrats like Professor Zubov. Masaryk University is one of the leaders in that effort, and I would like to thank you for that. I would conclude with a repetition of my conviction that democracy in Russia is possible, but only in the larger historical context and in longer time frame. But now we have to face evil and stay strong and united behind Ukraine and democracy. Thank you.
I would like to thank Mr. Kurfürst for his report and, I must say, very exact lecture. And I would now like to ask for a contribution from Ms. Petra Kuchyňková. Petra Kuchyňková is a doctor at the Faculty of Social Studies, Department of International Relations and European Studies, and her professional interests include Russia and Eastern Europe, and possibly the relationship between Russia and the European Union. Dear colleague, we look forward to your contribution.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished professors. I would also like to express my many thanks for the invitations to this distinguished event and the opportunity to comment on the speeches by Professor Zubov and the other guests. As my interest, as it was already said here, is connected especially with the domains of international relations and European studies, I will keep my comments mostly within these spheres, which are also very relevant, of course, in the context of current situation in Eastern Europe, as Mr. Kurfürst already said here, and I will try not to repeat the ideas which were already said here. Professor Zubov was speaking here about the prospects of successful transformation and democratization in Russia, but also in the context of the historic development of countries in Western, Central, and Eastern Europe. And he also spoke about the role of elites and intellectuals in this process. I would like to underline that a very important challenge would be also the searching for some possible model of non-expansionist, in various senses of this word, not only the military sense, relations between Russia and Europe, of Russia towards the countries in the so-called post-Soviet area and also the former Soviet satellites in Central and Eastern Europe. Because I would like to say that this may be a redefinition of Russian policy towards these partners, towards these countries. Didn't happen, unfortunately, and it is an integral part of the transformation of Russia itself. After the dissolution of Soviet Union, Russia had to redefine also its international position. And at the same time, this process was interconnected with the ongoing difficulties of Russian internal transition and transformation, and to a great extent also the reflection of uneasy processes within Russian society and political regime, which very soon gained the characteristics of some kind of hybrid regime developing into open authoritarianism. And these symptoms, unfortunately, were visible there already during the 1990s. As the authors, like for example Tsigankov, underlined, from beginnings of the formation of Russian Federation as the independent state in the 1990s, and even more visibly after 2000, there existed a mixture of intellectual and also political visions and ideas about the desirable directions of Russian foreign policy and the position of Russia in the post-Cold War world. And the ideas of so-called Atlantists, new westernizers, or Zapadniki, Western-oriented elite who were active especially in the first period of Gaidar's government and the very beginning of the 1990s, with the ideas of Russia belonging to Western civilization, with the USA and other Western actors as equal partners, were soon replaced with the revival of the ideas of the so-called neo-Eurasianists, speaking about genuine Russian civilizational mission, especially in the so-called post-Soviet area, or even open expansionists, like Vladimir Zhirinovsky, for example, among the politicians, or Alexander Dugin among the intellectuals. Already the first concept of Russian foreign policy in 1993, which is connected with the name of the first Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andrei Kozyrev, showed the kind of permanent tension between Russian effort to establish special partnership with the existing international organizations in Europe and Euro-Atlantic area like NATO and European Union, and the aspirations to exercise something like a vital interests, political, economic, cultural, and so on, in the areas in the post-Soviet region, which raised concerns, of course, that time, also among the post-communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe, including, of course, especially Baltic countries above all, where this exclusive zone of Russian vital interests ends, which areas they really cover. This emphasis was strengthened further in the second half of the 1990s, when Russian Foreign Affairs Minister Kozyrev was replaced with Yevgeny Primakov, experienced diplomat from Soviet times, and also a person close to Soviet and Russian secret services, which already showed certain tendencies, showing what could be the future direction in the process of selection and rise of Russian political elites. It is worth to mention here that also current Russian President Vladimir Putin actually began in his presidential office at the beginning of the 2000s with the initial rhetoric underlying that Russians are Europeans, wherever they live within Russian Federation. But the motivations were very and rather pragmatic than value-laden, of of course, which was visible from the fact that it was gradually transformed into total rejection of this initial, on first sight, pro-Western orientation or something like that of Russian foreign policy. This shift was being more and more visible with the growing tensions between the rising aspirations of the regime to exercise the interests and influence in the Central and Eastern European countries and South Caucasus, and the processes of Eastern enlargement of the European Union, NATO, and the establishment of the EU Eastern Partnership policy, which was, in fact, and by the way, also a kind of reaction to Georgian-Russian war in 2008. It means the clash between Russia and one of its neighbors. The events after 2012, when Mr. Putin again became officially the president, but he never left, in fact, this position. Also, he was on the first side replaced with Mr. Medvedev. The gradual building of Eurasian Economic Union and emphasizing also the need to somehow redefine world political economic order under the experience from such events like global financial crisis, were followed by the redefinition of Russian foreign policy and military doctrines, where NATO and the West started gradually to play the role of biggest adversaries of Russia, as well as we could observe the securitization of such instruments like energy sources, information, usage of information technologies and support for the so-called hybrid campaigns to exercise the interests even beyond the borders of the near abroad. All of these were just visible symptoms of these longer-term tendencies in the development of Putin's, and maybe not only Putin's, Russian foreign policy, which found its most tragic manifestation in current war in Ukraine. So the problem is that during the more than 30 years since the end of the Cold War, Russian political regimes, and also to a certain extent Russian society, because the development of Russian position towards the outside world goes also hand in hand with the internal developments in the country, haven't fully redefined and solved the optimal and sustainable relations free from the historic burdens of Russia towards Europe, the West, the former satellites in Central and Eastern Europe, to the countries in post-Soviet area. It is also possible to say that immediately before the start of the invasion of Ukraine, Putin's regime found itself somewhere at the crossroads in relation to the outside world and also to its own society in the context of current world of new technological challenges and changes, digitalization, new technologies in energy, and so on and so on. With the invasion of Ukraine, the regime addressed in a most violent way not only Europe and the world, but also, of course, and first and foremost, its domestic public, which already showed certain rare but some visible symptoms of dissatisfaction with the directions of internal developments in Russia. These two processes are directly interconnected. So all of these would be the big task also for the elites and intellectuals in Russia and also living now outside of Russia, of course, to think not only about the internal changes and transformation of Russia, but also to think about the peaceful and eligible, from the perspective of modern times, role of Russia in the current world, Europe, and in relation to its neighbors. It is one of the necessary conditions, and unfortunately, it will not be less difficult than to find the internal transformation, ways for internal transformation of Russia, and it will be not less difficult to find social consensus on this. Thank you very much. I didn't want to be too long, and also a lot of was said by the distinguished professors before me, so thank you.